She was 20 years old and, by the cold measure of the world, homeless. She had no family left, no roof that bore her name, no man of standing willing to speak for her. The Bank of Millbrook Hollow, under the seal of its president, Josiah Pruitt, had called in a debt she had never signed her name to, on a house that had sheltered her since she was 9, and had done so on a Tuesday morning with the flat, unhurried courtesy of a man closing a drawer. She had $35 to her name, counted twice into a handkerchief, and with it she would, within the week, buy 5 frozen, forgotten acres of dead apple trees and a stone well nobody in the county of Cordwell would touch, for the sum of $14 even, paid to an auctioneer who could not stop smiling as he took it. Men standing in that cold yard called her a fool before she had finished counting out the coins. They did not know that sealed behind the mortared stones of that well-weighted something that would not only feed her through a hard winter, but would loosen, stone by stone, the very foundation of the man who had put her out into the road, and would give a dead man's name back to a town that had let it be forgotten. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Della Mae Vance. If you are watching this from a place that feels forgotten too, tell us in the comments below. We would like to know it. Della Mae Vance had been born in the spring of 1866 in a clapboard house at the edge of Millbrook Hollow, Nebraska, where the Loup River bent through cottonwoods, and the air in April smelled of turned black earth and wood smoke. Her father worked a rented quarter section, and her mother took in mending, and there was never much, but there was enough, until the summer Della turned 9, when a typhoid fever came up the river valley the way weather comes, indifferent and total, and took both her parents within 9 days of each other. She remembered very little of that summer except the smell of vinegar rags and the sound of her mother's voice going quiet, and she remembered Ezra Talbot standing in the doorway of the sick room afterward with his hat already off, because he had known, before anyone told him, that he would be taking her home with him. Ezra Talbot was a stonemason and a well digger, a broad, slow-spoken man in his 50s, who had known Della's father since they were boys fishing the same bend of the Loop, and he took the girl in without ceremony, and without ever once making her feel the debt of it. He lived alone in a stone house he had built himself, 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen, at the edge of town, where the good farmland gave way to the limestone outcrops that had made him a living for 30 years. And it was there, in the yard behind that house, among blocks of raw stone and coils of hemp rope and the iron tripod he used for lowering himself into wells, that Della grew up learning a trade most old girls in Millbrook Hollow never touched. Ezra never treated it as strange. He handed her a mason's hammer before she was 11 and taught her to read the grain of a stone the way another man might teach a daughter to read a hymnal, with patience and repetition and an unhurried reverence for getting it exactly right. She learned to run her palm flat across a quarried face and feel, before her eyes confirmed it, where a hidden fault line would betray a careless strike. She learned the particular ring of a hammer on good limestone, a clean, almost bell-like note, and the duller, wronger sound it made when a stone was cracked inside where you could not see it. She learned to build a dry wall that would stand 100 years without a lick of mortar, each stone chosen and turned and set, so its own weight locked it in place. And she learned, most of all, how to dig and line a well, how to sink a shaft plumb true through clay and shale, how to set curved field stones in a ring so tight and so balanced that the earth itself could push against them for a lifetime and never bow the wall, how to leave, here and there, in the old fashion Ezra had learned from his own master, small false cavities behind certain stones, pockets no wider than a man's 2 fists, meant in the old country for a farmer to hide a coin purse or a deed from a landlord's tax collector, a trick of the trade passed down like a secret handshake, useful and half forgotten. It was Ezra who gave her the plumb bob. She was 13, and he had just finished teaching her to hang a true vertical line down the throat of a well shaft. How the little brass weight, if you let it settle and stop touching the cord, would tell you truer than your own eye ever could, whether the stones above were leaning toward disaster. When the lesson was done, he took the plumb bob off its cord, an old brass weight, wasted like a spinning top, polished by 40 years of his own hands and stamped with the worn initials E.T., and pressed it into her palm and closed her fingers over it. "A plumb line never lies to you," he told her. Not if you let it hang stilt and trust what it shows you, even when what it shows you is that everything you built is off true. He said a man's word ought to be the same way. She kept it after that on a leather thong around her neck, tucked beneath her collar, and she took it out at night sometimes just to turn it in the lamplight and feel the worn letters under her thumb. He died when she was 18, not from any accident of the trade that had shaped his whole body into something as solid and dependable as the stone he worked, but from a wasting sickness in his lungs that came on slow over a winter and would not be argued with. The same quiet, undramatic thief that had taken her parents, only patient this time, taking its full 8 months. She nursed him through it without ever once letting him see her weep, because he had never once, in 9 years, let her see him afraid, and she thought she owed him the same courtesy. He died in April, with the cottonwoods just budding outside the window, and left her the stone house, the tools, and no money at all, because he had never in his life charged a fair price for honest work, and had forgiven more debts than he had ever collected. It was 6 weeks after the funeral that Josiah Pruitt sent for her. Josiah Pruitt had inherited the presidency of the Millbrook Hollow Trust and savings from his father the way other men inherit a watch, and he wore the office the same way, close to his chest, ticking along on schedule. He was not a large man nor a loud one. His cruelty had never needed volume. He received Della in his office behind a desk so clean it seemed to disapprove of dust, with a ledger open in front of him and a clerk standing by the door, and he informed her, in the tone of a man reading a weather report, that Ezra Talbot had, in the year before his death, taken a note against the stone house to cover the cost of a new set of well-digging tools and a doctor's bill, that the note had come due upon his death by the standard terms of the paper, and that the estate, having no funds to satisfy it, would be foreclosed upon within the month. I am sorry for your loss, Josiah Pruitt said, and did not sound it. But sentiment doesn't clear a ledger, Miss Vance. The account is the account, and it does not know that you were fond of him. She asked, very quietly, whether there might be some arrangement, some time. He told her the bank could extend her $35 as a relocation courtesy, out of respect for Mr. Talbot's long standing in the community, and that the house would be listed for sale within the fortnight. He slid the money across the desk in a small canvas bag already counted, and did not look up again from his ledger. She did not argue. She did not weep. Not there, not in front of him. She took the bag, and she thanked him, because her mother had raised her to be civil, even to men who did not deserve it. And she walked home along the river road with her spine straight. And that night, alone in the stone house for the last time, she packed one trunk with her clothes and Ezra's tools that were small enough to carry, and she put the plumb bob's thong around her neck where it had lived for 7 years, and in the morning she walked to the depot and bought a ticket west to wherever the money and a rumor might take her. The rumor, picked up from a freight agent who liked to talk, was of a county auction out past the Forks, in a dry, high township called Cordwell, where a bank was clearing abandoned parcels off its books all in a single Saturday, land nobody wanted, sold as for whatever it would bring. She rode 2 days by rail, and then a half day more on the bench seat of a farmer's wagon who was headed that direction anyway, and she watched the country change beneath her, the way a fever changes a face. Millbrook Hollow had been green and close, and river damp, cottonwood and black earth, and as the wagon carried her west and north, the land opened and paled, the grass going from deep green to a dry gold gray, the air losing its softness and taking on a thin, mineral clarity that carried sound strangely far, so that a dog barking on a distant claim seemed to arrive at her ear whole and unhurried. The smell of wood smoke and river mud gave way to the smell of dust and sage, and once, unaccountably, of cold stone, though there was no stone to be seen for miles, only the flat shoulders of the land and the enormous unbroken sky pressing down on it. She rode with her trunk between her boots and Ezra's tools wrapped in oilcloth beneath the seat, and she did not cry on that ride, though something in her chest had gone very still and very careful, the way a wall goes still once you have found its plumb line and know, at last, exactly what you are working with. Cordwell in the January cold was a huddle of frame buildings around a crossroads, a bank, a mercantile, a church with a leaning steeple, and it was outside the mercantile that the county auction had gathered its crowd, 40 or 50 men in heavy coats stamping their feet against the cold, breath rising off them in a single communal cloud, while a stout, red-faced man named Hiram Bexley stood on an overturned crate and called out parcels one after another in a voice built for outdoor work. Most of the land went for what it was worth, decent quarter sections with a barn standing and a well that ran. But near the end of the list, Bexley called out a parcel that made several of the men laugh outright before he had even finished the description. 5 acres. Once the orchard of a man named Elias Hollis, apple trees standing dead in their rows for going on 20 years, the ground rocky and untillable, and on it a single stone-lined well, dry as a bone and half of it choked with ice, that no one in the township had drawn water from in living memory. Bexley called it a curiosity more than a property. Nobody wanted a dead orchard and a frozen well. Della raised her hand. A ripple of laughter went through the crowd, and a heavy-set man near the front, Walt Drummond, who ran the livery, called out that the little lady would do better buying a bridge, since at least a bridge went somewhere. Bexley, delighted by the sudden interest in a lot he had expected to give away, asked her twice whether she understood what she was bidding on. Dead trees and a well full of ice, and she told him, in a voice that did not rise or waver, that she understood exactly, and that she would give $14 for it. Nobody bid against her, not because $14 was too rich a price, but because nobody wanted the parcel at any price at all, and Bexley, still grinning, brought his gavel down and declared it sold. She counted the money into his palm in coins, exact to the penny, and he wrote her out a receipt by hand on a torn half-sheet of paper, misspelling her name as Vance, and told her, not unkindly, that she'd bought herself the biggest joke in 3 counties. She folded the receipt into the same handkerchief that had held her money, and walked the 1.5 miles out to see what she had bought. The orchard stood on a low rise above a dry creek bed. 20 rows of apple trees gone gray and brittle, their branches like something drawn in charcoal against the flat white sky. And at the center of it, ringed by a collapsing stub of an old fence, stood the well, a squat cylinder of fitted fieldstone rising 3 feet above the frozen ground, its mouth choked with a plug of ice. The stones themselves furred with frost and lichen, and the kind of silence that settles over a place people have decided to forget. She stood looking at it for a long while in the cold, and then she went to work, because there was no other direction to go. Her first days were not spent on the well at all, but on the plain arithmetic of staying alive through a Nebraska winter, with $14 gone and 21 left. She found, in the leaning remains of what had once been the Hollis farmhouse, half a mile down the rise, enough sound roof over one corner room to keep the worst of the wind off, and she patched it further with canvas from her trunk and a bit of daubed clay, working until her hands ached, because Ezra had taught her that shelter was not a thing you waited for, it was a thing you built. Water she solved by melting snow in an iron pot over a fire of deadfall branches, brackish and smoky but enough, until she could determine whether the well itself might be coaxed back to life. It was on her 3rd morning, gathering wood along the frozen creek bed, that she met Amos Ferris, an old man with a face like weathered harness leather and a coat patched in 4 different fabrics, who kept bees in the warm months on a scrap of land a mile off, and who had, he told her without much preamble, worked this very orchard as a boy of 12 under old Elias Hollis himself. Back before it all went to ruin, he was suspicious of her, at first. The way anyone in that country was suspicious of a stranger doing something as foolish as buying dead land. And he told her plainly that she'd been cheated, that the orchard had been cursed as far as the township was concerned since Hollis lost it, though he would not say more than that. But he watched her split wood with a competence that surprised him, watched her true up a sagging doorframe with 2 shims and a level eye, and by the end of that first week, when she offered him a share of whatever firewood or forage she cleared in exchange for his knowledge of the land, and his willingness to lend a second pair of hands, he agreed. Less because he needed the wood, she suspected, than because he was lonely, and because something in her steadiness reminded him, he said once, of men he had known in better days. It was Amos who told her the well had never, in his memory as a boy, run dry on its own. It had been a good well, deep and reliable, the pride of the orchard, until the year everything changed, and then it had simply been let go, plugged with debris, and abandoned along with the trees as though the whole property had been struck by some grief nobody would name. She asked him what had happened to Elias Hollis. Amos only shook his head and said that was a long story for another night, and went back to stacking wood. She began work on the well on the fourth day, and it was not romantic labor. The mouth was sealed with a solid plug of ice 18 inches deep, and she spent the better part of that first day simply breaking it apart, working a heavy iron bar Ezra had left her down through the cracks the cold had already made, levering out chunks of ice slick and heavy as stove wood, hauling them up hand over hand in a bucket, and dumping them clear of the mouth, so the meltwater would not simply refreeze into the shaft overnight. Her palms blistered inside her gloves by mid-afternoon, and she wrapped them in strips of flannel and kept working, because Ezra had taught her that a job half finished in cold weather was worse than a job not started, since the water you'd already loosened would only freeze harder come nightfall. By the second day, she had broken through to open shaft, black water gleaming 8 feet down, and she rigged the old tripod, which she had carried the full mile and a half from the farmhouse in 2 trips lashed to a travois of branches, and lowered herself down on a bosun's chair of knotted rope. The way Ezra had taught her to descend any well, weight tested twice before she trusted it, a second line always tied off separate from the first. Inside the shaft, the air was cold and mineral and utterly still, and she worked by lantern light, running her palm flat across the fitted stones the way Ezra had taught her, feeling for the particular texture of a wall that had been built to last against a wall that had been altered. Most of the lining was exactly what she expected. Tight, expert fieldstone work, each stone chosen for its neighbor, the whole ring locked by its own weight into a silence that had held for decades. But 4 feet below the frost line, on the north-facing curve of the shaft, her fingers found something her eyes had not yet caught. A seam. A single course of stone, 6 courses down, that did not sit flush the way the rest did. A hairline gap packed with old mortar that was a slightly different color than its neighbors, grayer, newer by the feel of it, though newer here still meant 20 years old. She struck it once with the flat of her hammer, the testing blow Ezra had drilled into her 1,000 times, and the sound that came back was wrong, hollow where the rest of the wall rang solid. The duller, wronger note of stone with air behind it. She did not tear into it that hour. She climbed out, ate a cold supper, and came back the next morning with her chisels warmed by the fire, so the steel would not crack in the cold, and she worked the seam the way Ezra had taught her to work any delicate joint, patient, incremental, a series of shallow taps, walking the chisel along the mortar line, rather than one violent strike that might bring the whole course down on her, clearing dust and old lime a spoonful at a time into a cloth held beneath the work so nothing would be lost. It took her the better part of 2 full days, descending each morning, working until her arms shook, and the light from the lantern began to gutter, climbing out each evening to eat and sleep and warm her hands by the fire, Amos bringing her, on the second evening, a jar of honey and a look that had gone from skeptical to something closer to respect, because he had watched her haul that tripod alone and had begun, without saying so, to understand what kind of woman had bought the orchard. On the third day, working the last of the loosened stone free with the flat of her bar, the stone shifted, tilted, and came away in her arms all at once, heavier than she'd braced for, so that she had to catch it against her chest and hold it there a long moment in the cold dark of the shaft, her breath loud in her own ears. Behind it, set into a cavity no wider than a bread box, sat a lard tin rusted at the seams but whole, wrapped twice round with oiled canvas gone stiff with age, and beside it wedged upright, a second smaller bundle wrapped the same way. She did not open them there. She climbed out slowly, the bundles cradled against her body inside her coat, and carried them into the farmhouse, and set them by the fire to let the cold leave them before she trusted the metal not to crack. And it was Amos, arriving that evening with more wood, who sat across the hearth from her and watched, in silence, as she finally worked the lid of the tin free with the flat of a knife. Inside, folded in oiled cloth, lay 11 gold eagles, $10 pieces, dulled but whole, and beneath them, wrapped in a second layer of cloth to keep it the damp off, a thick fold of papers. And it was those papers, not the gold, that made Amos Ferris go very still and very quiet in a way that told her, before she had read a word, that she had found something larger than money. The papers were in 2 hands, The first was a mortgage receipt, dated 18 years back, stamped paid in full over the signature of Cyrus Pruitt, founder of the Cordwell branch of the very bank whose Millbrook Hollow office now carried Cyrus's grandson, Josiah, as its president. The two banks, she would learn from Amos that same night, having been sister institutions under the same family since before either town had a proper church. The second was a letter, 4 pages, written in a careful, aging hand and addressed simply to whoever finds this, if anyone ever does. It was signed Elias Hollis and dated the winter of 1868. The letter told, in plain, unhurried sentences that seemed to Della to carry the same patient dignity Ezra's own hands had carried, the story of an early frost that had killed a season's harvest, of a loan taken against the orchard to see the family through the winter, of that loan being paid off in full the following autumn with the last good crop the orchard ever bore, the receipt for it obtained and kept, exactly as any careful man would keep it. And then, the letter said, it's not 2 years later, Cyrus Pruitt had come to him with a second document, a foreclosure notice, claiming the original note had never been satisfied, that the bank's own ledger showed a balance still owing, and that the orchard would be seized within 30 days unless Hollis could produce proof otherwise. Hollis had searched for his receipt and could not find it, his house having burned in a grass fire the spring before that took half his papers with it, and Cyrus Pruitt, who Hollis believed now had arranged that very ledger entries himself, using the fire as cover, pressed the claim with the flat, immovable confidence of a man who knew his victim could not answer paper with anything but paper. Hollis had, at the last, found the receipt after all, tucked inside a Bible his late wife had kept, but by then Cyrus Pruitt had already filed the seizure with the county, and greased the right palms to see it upheld before a circuit judge who owed the bank his own mortgage. And Hollis, an old man by then, worn down and without funds for a lawyer of his own, had watched the orchard taken from him on a technicality of timing that a court in a larger town would have laughed out the door. Rather than let the true receipt fall into Cyrus Pruitt's hands to be destroyed the way the first fire had conveniently destroyed everything else, Hollis had hidden it, with what gold he had left from that final harvest, inside the well he himself had helped his own father build 40 years before, in one of the old hidden courses the original stonemason had left for exactly such a purpose, sealed it with fresh mortar mixed by his own hand, and left the county for Cheyenne, where, Amos said quietly into the firelight, word had eventually come back that he had died alone in a boarding house some years later. His name never cleared, his orchard's ruin blamed by the township, in the absence of any other explanation, on nothing more than bad luck and an early frost. Della sat a long while with the letter open on her knee, the fire cracking low, and she did not weep, though something in her went very still. The same stillness she had felt walking out of Josiah Pruitt's office with the canvas bag of relocation money in her hand. She understood, cold clarity of a plumb line settling to true, exactly what she was holding. Not simply a dead man's gold, but a dead man's proof, and a straight, unbroken line of paper cruelty running from a grandfather who had stolen an orchard by forging a debt to a grandson who had, in almost the same season, stolen a stone house from her by the very same trick, dressed up in the same cold arithmetic. Sentiment doesn't clear a ledger. She thought of Josiah Pruitt's voice saying it, and understood now that it was a sentence that had likely been said, in one form or another, by his own grandfather, in that same office, to Elias Hollis 17 years before she was born. Word of the gold did not stay quiet long, not in a township as small as Cordwell, and within a fortnight it had reached, by whatever crooked path such things travel, the ear of Josiah Pruitt himself, who arrived by hired buggy on a cold Saturday with a lawyer beside him, and a claim already prepared, asserting that any find upon the old Hollis parcel, having belonged originally to property once mortgaged to a Pruitt institution, rightfully reverted to the bank under the terms of an old and half-forgotten lien nobody but his own family's lawyers could locate. Walt Drummond and 2 other men from the livery stood nearby that day with the particular idle interest of men who enjoyed watching a woman get put back in her place, and for one long afternoon it seemed the whole township of Cordwell would take the bank's side simply out of habit, the same habit that had let Elias Hollis's name be quietly erased 20 years before. Della listened to the claim read aloud in its entirety, without once raising her voice or her hand, and then she produced, from inside her coat, the paid mortgage receipt bearing Cyrus Pruitt's own signature and Elias Hollis's letter in full, and asked the assembled men calmly whether the bank cared to have both read into the county record alongside its new claim. Josiah Pruitt's lawyer found urgent business elsewhere within the hour, and Josiah himself said nothing further, though the look that crossed his face, Amos told her later, was the look of a man watching a ledger he had never expected to be balanced come due all at once. She could have taken both documents to the county seat that same week and seen Josiah Pruitt's name dragged through every paper between there and Millbrook Hollow, could have sued the bank in open court, and likely won every dollar of costs and damages a judge could award, and Amos, and even Walt Drummond, once he came around to her side, urged her to do exactly that. She refused. A public trial would take the gold and the good it could do and turn it into a spectacle, would make Elias Hollis's quiet, dignified ruin into a newspaper curiosity, and would, she said, put the restoring of a wronged man's name in the hands of the very kind of paper power that had wronged him in the first place. Justice measured out in a courtroom still left the courtroom in charge. She wanted something that could not be appealed or refiled or bought off with a clever lawyer, and so instead, over the following weeks, working quietly and mostly through Amos, who knew every family in the township and which of them still owed the Pruitt Bank a debt older than they could easily pay, she began, with the 11 gold eagles converted carefully and without fanfare through a sympathetic clerk at a rival bank 2 towns over, to pay off small debts anonymously, a widow's mortgage here, a blacksmith's overdue note there, always through a third party, always without her name attached, so that families who had spent years afraid of the mail simply woke one morning to find their obligations marked satisfied. She used a portion to reopen and clean the well itself, and a portion more to replant a dozen young apple saplings along the old rows, and she filed, quietly, at the county seat, not a suit, but a simple corrected deed, using Hollis's own letter and receipt as evidentiary attachment, restoring the name Hollis to the parcel's recorded history, not as an accusation, but as a fact set right. Within a season, without a single dramatic confrontation, the story of the forged Hollis foreclosure had nonetheless made its way, family by family, through Cordwell and back east to Millbrook Hollow, carried not by newspaper, but by the much more durable currency of kitchen table talk, and the Pruitt name, in both towns, began to accumulate the particular, unspoken weight that falls on men whose ledgers turn out at last to have been read by someone else. Josiah Pruitt was not arrested. He was not ruined in an afternoon. He simply began, over the following year, to find fewer men willing to sit across a desk from him, his bank's deposits thinning quietly the way water thins from a cracked cistern, until the erosion of his standing did, slowly and without any single dramatic blow, what a courtroom might have done in a day, and left far angrier in its wake. Through that same season, Della became, without quite intending it, a fixture of Cordwell rather than its joke. Old Mrs. Ferris, Amos's widowed sister-in-law, began leaving a covered dish of stew on the farmhouse step some evenings, and would not be thanked for it beyond a nod. Della, in turn, spent a cold afternoon resetting the sagging gatepost at the Drummond livery, the very Walt Drummond who had jeered at her in the auction yard, and did the work without comment, so that the gate simply swung true again the next morning, and he was left to draw his own conclusions. She repaired, at the request of the Cordwell Church's aging deacon, 3 courses of crumbling foundation stone beneath the leaning steeple, the same steeple that had watched over her arrival as a stranger, working alone in the cold with her breath fogging and her chisel ringing clean against good limestone. And when she was done, the steeple stood a full 2 inches straighter than it had in a decade, and the deacon told the story of it from the pulpit the following Sunday without needing to embellish a word. Amos Os Ferris, who had begun the winter suspicious of a foolish girl who had bought a curse, ended it teaching her to keep bees in exchange for her teaching 2 of the younger Ferris boys to true up a stone wall. And by the time the apple saplings she had planted put out their first tentative leaves that spring, nobody in Cordwell called the parcel the joke of 3 counties anymore. They called it the Hollis Orchard, the way it had always deserved to be called, and they called her, simply, Della Vance, without the qualifier of stranger or fool that had followed her off the auctioneer's crate. It was in early summer, the orchard rose green again for the first time in 20 years, that she stood one evening at the low doorway of the farmhouse she had patched with her own hands into something that could honestly now be called home, and looked back out toward the well, its stones cleared and mortared true, a new oak bucket hanging steady on a new rope, and she took the plumb bob out from beneath her collar, the way she still did most evenings, and let it hang free from its cord in the last of the daylight, watching it settle, as it always did, into perfect, patient stillness. She thought of Ezra's hands closing hers over the brass all those years ago, of his voice telling her that a plumb line never lies to you if you trust what it shows, even when it shows you everything is off true. She thought of Elias Hollis, a man she had never met and never could, whose careful, unhurried letter had trusted its own truth to a stone wall for 18 years, waiting for someone patient enough to come looking. She thought of her own stone house in Millbrook Hollow, sold off now to some stranger, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she did not grieve it. Not standing here at this threshold, because a house, she understood now, was never really the walls of it. It was whatever true thing you managed to build and protect inside them. It was, she thought, turning the worn brass once more between her fingers before tucking it back beneath her collar, the best $14 she had ever spent. We want to thank you truly for spending this evening with Della Mae Vance and the orchard that waited so patiently behind its own stones. If her story moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need to hear it. Someone who has ever been told, by a ledger or a landlord or simply by hard luck, that what they had left was worthless. We would love to know, what have you found value in that others had already written off? Let us know in the comments below. We read every single one. Until the next story, take care of yourselves and take care of each other.